Oh, it's a great day here at catchat.com. I'm Joe, the developer. I just love working at CatChat. It's just such a great place to work. And let's see, let me commit some code like I usually do every day. Oh, I think I just put my private key for catchat.com on a public repo. I feel like somebody told me to call security if this happens. All right, let's see. Hello, security.
Oh, I'm getting a phone call. Hang on. I'm just here at CatChat. I'm security at CatChat wearing my white hat up here at CatChat headquarters. Hello, this is security at CatChat. How can I help you?
Yeah, security. So I made a big mistake. I committed the private key of catchat.com's TLS certificate to GitHub.
Oh, no, that's the one we use to encrypt all the traffic with our users.
I know.
All right, so let me think about that. We need to come up with a game plan here. Let me think. All right, so I think what we should probably do is step one, we'll make a new certificate.
Right.
And
okay.
we've got a nice automation framework for that. We use acme.sh. It'll be real easy. And then step two is we'll revoke the old one.
Revoke it.
And we should do that in that order so that there's no downtime.
Can you do that? I don't know how to do that.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I've used acme.sh a whole bunch. Let me just run this command real quick. All right, I got the new certificate.
Good.
All right, so I'll deploy that now, and that's all good to go. And now I'll just handle this little revocation of the old one, and it's revoked. It's revoked, so I think we're up in business again.
So it's not a problem that our private key is public now?
Well, so the old certificate is revoked now.
Okay, good. Okay, sounds great. Thank you.
Alrighty then. Thanks. Can I help you with anything else wearing my white hat here at Security CatChat?
No, CatChat, thanks.
All right, thanks so much, Joe, the developer at CatChat, wearing his white hat.
All right. All right. It's another great day here. HackerMan1 here at Hacker Collective. HackerMan2, how you feeling?
It's just a great day, yeah, here at the Hacker headquarters, wearing my black hat. I like my black hat here at Hacker headquarters.
So, get this. CatChat.
Oh, that's been a target for a long time.
They leaked their private key.
Their TLS private key.
They leaked it.
We could decrypt all their user traffic.
That's what I'm saying. It's great.
We could go to Starbucks and start looking at all the CatChats with that key.
Oh, wait, though. Looks like they revoked the cert.
They revoked the cert? What? They have some kind of amazing security team over there. They're one step ahead of us. What are we going to do?
You know, I just checked again. They reused the same private key for the new TLS cert.
Wait a second. You're saying you looked at the TLS certificates and you saw that the key that they had was the same for both of them?
For both?
I don't know if I've ever heard of that before, but it's kind of like reusing passwords, but for certificates. Wait a second. Let me just code up a little exploit here. Now we can decrypt all the CatChat traffic still. That's amazing.
Woohoo! Oh, thank you. So I'm Joe, this is Dylan, and let's provide some context to what that was, aside from great acting. But what happened, Dylan? Can you explain what was going on there?
Yeah, all right, so let's take a step back and just talk about TLS, all right? So way back in the day, no websites used encryption, and this was a problem because you could literally sit at Starbucks and look at all the traffic between people and websites that they were talking to. You could modify that traffic. It was a mess, right? And so to fix this problem, we rolled out this big encryption thing called TLS. And the way TLS works is basically, it's a very decentralized, fast, efficient way for these central authorities called certificate authorities. They go to websites like CatChat, Facebook, Google, whoever. Google proves that they own the domain. And then these certificate authorities will sign a piece of paper called a certificate saying that this key from that website is like the one that everybody should trust. And then the end users just take a look at that certificate. They see it's signed by a valid certificate authority. They don't have to check any third parties or anything. They do this all locally. They do that quick cryptographic check, and they're like, yes, this is the right key for the website, and I can encrypt traffic to that website. And that's a 10,000-foot view of how certificate and TLS works. But here's the challenge. When the certificate authorities check the website and then they sign the key that the website says they're using for encryption, it's not their job to make sure that that key is secure. It's not their job to look at that key at all. And so if you generate an insecure key or a reuse key or whatever, the certificate authority is just going to sign it blindly. Their only job is to validate you own the domain and grant the certificate for whatever key you happen to use. And so this, of course, begs the question, are people doing insecure things with their keys? And one of the most insecure things we can think of is maybe reusing keys between services.
And it's kind of like password reuse.
Oh, password reuse. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this is less of a problem now, and probably for everybody in the audience, you're probably all using password managers, but I don't know, my family members might not all be on there, and they might be using the same password, username and password on one site, right? And so there's the advent of credential stuffing attacks where people are testing the same username and password from, say, one leak of data across a whole other bunch of services. And this is kind of similar. If one key is leaking from one domain related to one TLS cert, if that's available and it's attached to another certificate for another subdomain, a different domain altogether, kind of seems like that's an issue.
That sounds pretty similar, actually. So it basically, if a private key gets exposed, if that's reused between multiple domains, then that's not just a problem with the one website. It could be a problem with everywhere that different certificates might be using that private key. So that sounds like a kind of like a hypothetical attack.
Yeah, so before we get into seeing real examples of that happening, do you mind explaining a little bit about why is it so bad that a private key actually leaks out?
Yeah, so go back to our Starbucks example. Before the encryption, you could sit in Starbucks and you could look at all the traffic. All right, a word for that attack is monster in the middle. So what happens if you have the encryption key is it's kind of just a throwback as if there was no encryption there, right? You can use that key to decrypt the traffic in that Starbucks. You could use that key to inject things or to pretend like you're the website. And in theory, Starbucks isn't our only attack vector. If you're an ISP or you're sitting in the network, then you could do these attacks as well. But everybody could sit in a Starbucks and do this attack if they have the private keys to these encryption websites, basically. So, okay, I mean, this sounds like it's a hypothetical problem, but are people actually reusing their keys between certificates? I mean, that can't be a common thing, right?
We took a look. About 10%-ish are reusing the same.
10%? That's a huge number. You're saying 10% of all certificates everywhere are reusing the same private key as a different certificate?
Ish, yeah, more or less. It's crazy, right?
I never would have guessed it, anything like that. Double-digit percentage.
And it doesn't mean that the keys have been exposed. It just means that the same private key is being used over and over again, which is just it's so crazy. Because we know not to do that with passwords, but we don't know to do that as an industry with private keys when we're generating these certificates.
Yeah, I'm a little stumped here. Why is this number so big?
There's a lot of reasons. So first, let me explain how we generally got to this number. So
there's so many certificates out there. How'd you get that number? I'm skeptical.
Yeah, it's good to be skeptical. There's this thing called certificate transparency. It started as a Google project. It's a whole industry project now. And it started because in 2011, among other incidents, there was this big incident with a CA and this is a screenshot from their website, DigiNotar in Europe. And basically what happened, as the story goes in blog posts, I wasn't involved in it, so I don't know 100%, but based on this story, it was an Iranian threat actor that hacked into the CA. They're able to issue certificates for Google domains like gmail.com. They then were able to, as an ISP in Iran, redirect their citizens' traffic to a site that they controlled. They showed the valid, legitimate that they misissued from this CA for gmail.com. And they're able to read emails, among other activities.
I'll bet I knew which color hat they were wearing.
Yeah. And so seeing that, Google rightfully was like, well, I want to know and have some indication if somebody's misissuing a certificate for a domain that I control. But there really wasn't an easy way to do that. And so they created certificate transparency. This is a convoluted image, but it's really quite simple. The idea is if you have some server that you want to get a certificate issued for, you go to a CA, right, like Dylan was explaining. They issue you the certificate after you prove everything they need to prove. And then the CA is going to log that with certificate transparency logs. And then there are monitors that will monitor the logs for various different purposes. You can set up notifications, like if you own trufflesecurity.com, it will let you know if that domain has been issued, another certificate has been issued with that domain, things like that. And so there's this concept of logs and monitors. And it's pretty cool. And there's the easiest way, if you guys are interested, if you haven't tried this before, to query that data is cert.sh. I think it's Sectigo sponsors that project. It's just like a search engine. You can plug in any domain. You can plug in different parts of domains and their advanced search, and you can dig down and see exactly what the deal is with the issuance of certificates across different CAs.
So yeah, I mean, I'm starting to understand now. So now every time a certificate gets created, it has to be logged centrally, and then you could take all those certificates and run your analysis.
Yeah, and so there's billions of them. I think it's probably more than 7 billion now.
That's like almost how many people there are on the planet. That's a lot of certificates.
That's a lot. So we downloaded those and we reviewed them, and that's where the number ultimately came from.
So 10% of those 7 billion were sharing the same key as another one.
More or less, yeah.
That's crazy.
It's crazy.
That's crazy.
And another thing that we were able to take a look at, and this is from RFC's docs, is there is a code that says if you revoke a certificate, and we'll explain certificate revocation a bit more in a couple slides, but if you revoke a certificate, you can provide a reason why you revoked it. And some of our research hinged on the fact that there is a code called key compromise. So we're able to actually dig in and see examples of organizations that had their key compromised, and then what did they do next with that key? Did they issue more certificates? Foreshadowing, yes, they did.
No, wait a second, Joe. I've known everybody leaks keys out, but
yeah.
Just be honest with me. The last time you leaked a private key out and you had to revoke it, did you put key compromised as the reason?
No chance. I would put not specified. So the number one and the default in some of the tools to automate this is not specified. So we sampled some of the key revocation data, and the vast majority are not specifying the reason why the certificate has been revoked.
All right, so when we talk about keys that are compromised, we're specifically talking about companies that went out of their way to say they're revoking it because their key was compromised. But most people aren't going to do that. Most people are just going to put unspecified. We didn't research that, but obviously that makes up the lion's share of the key revocation.
Yeah, it's also kind of, if you say it's been compromised, like there's no real benefit to saying it. It's just kind of advertising that your key was compromised. You probably would want to put not specified. So that kind of makes sense, but it makes it a little harder to do some of this research. But that's the background context. So to answer the question, why are keys, private keys, being reused in certificate generation, let's talk first a little bit about revocation.
Yeah, so you mentioned before that people are putting unspecified and they wouldn't want to advertise that their key got compromised. One of the big reasons is that revocation at its core just kind of goes a little bit against some of our TLS principles, right? TLS is supposed to be, you do all of the cryptographic checks locally and you don't have to talk to a third party. If you had to talk to somebody else before you start encrypting traffic with a website, you're going to get a little bit of a latency hit, right? So if I have to check to see if the cert's revoked, I got to reach out and say, hey, is the cert revoked? We get a little bit of a latency hit. And browsers are not in the they're not in the business of adding latency when you're talking to websites. And so this led to browsers adding all these tricks, like Chrome will have this Bloom filter cache that they update once a week where all the revoked certs are like baked into your browser, but then it's like a whole week delay before you get the new ones, and Bloom filters have other issues. So it's like this revocation process is not as simple and straightforward as you revoke the key and then it can't be used anymore. It's a little bit more nuanced and complicated, and sometimes it could be used for a little while longer. It's messy.
But as an industry, we did come together and figure out some type of intermediate hacky solution.
Oh yeah, we band-aided over this whole problem. Basically what we said was, all right, we got these problems of keys leaking out and compromise and stuff like that. Our revocation system is broken. So the way we're gonna fix this problem is we're gonna take certificates that used to last 10 years, you used to be able to have a certificate that lasts 10 years, and you get it revoked and then you have to like years and years longer, right? And then we've shifted that down shorter and shorter and shorter. And now these days, you can get a certificate that only lasts a few days, right? Maybe it's 90 days is how long your certificate lasts. And so this is the way we papered over this problem, is like, all right, let's just make our certificates last a short period of time. So our revocation system is broken. All right, the certificates, it's got a compromised key. So within 90 days, people won't use the old one anymore. We'll be on to the new one. So we kind of just papered over this problem by making the certificates shorter lived. But if you think back to what we said a second ago, which is sometimes keys are reused between certificates, this protection is maybe getting undone a little bit, right? It's like we went from 90-day certs, but if every cert is using the same key and one gets compromised here, it's like, what's the point of the short-lived cert in the first place?
And so let's dig a little deeper here. The Acme protocol, right? That's kind of underpinning a lot of the short-lived certificates. General idea, very high level. I prove that I have ownership over some domain that I want to cert for. The CACs that I have the ownership, they give me the certificate. It's all automated. I'm sure a lot of folks in the audience have used the Acme protocol. There's a lot of tools that we have at our disposal to automate short-lived cert generation. This is what we were using internally, Cert Manager. And we didn't know this until we started doing the research. If you dig down in the docs and it's underlined in green, it basically says the default is to reuse the same private key over and over and over and over again.
That is wild, but this starts to make a little bit more sense. We're talking about 10% of all certs reusing the same key, and we're also saying that certs are getting shorter lived, so we need more of them.
Yep.
It seems like the automation has poured gas on the fire. It hasn't fixed the problem, it's just made us reuse keys more, and that's why maybe that 10% is where that number's coming from.
That's our best understanding. And so if you haven't heard of Cert Manager, maybe you've heard of CertBot, they default to not using the same private key, but the second most popular tool is acme.sh.
That's the one they use at CatChat. I remember that.
CatChat used it. And the default is to reuse the private key. There's this flag at the bottom that has 5 words, always force new domain key. No one's going to remember that command line. Maybe if you're digging through the docs and you know that you shouldn't reuse it, you might put it in there. But the default is not, secure. I mean, it's reusing passwords, basically.
Well, so why do you think these developers did this? Can we get into their heads somehow? What do you think they were thinking?
Fortunately, there's an issue with people saying, why are you doing this? And one of the maintainers was basically like, we don't want to take any destructive actions against sensitive files on disk for our users. We don't want to overwrite a private key. That's an admirable and understandable perspective, but it still perpetuates this issue of reusing the same private key.
So, okay, they didn't want to stomp over the old private key just in case maybe that was sensitive data, they didn't want to destroy it. And I'm guessing they didn't want to make a new file because then they'd fill out the disk over time. They just had to key and key and key and key, and eventually the disk would run out. So maybe they made this choice a little bit on the side of like usability and less on the side of security, something like that.
Sounds right.
Okay, so what's the best practices here? Like this, obviously, like the one cert generator is doing one thing, the other cert generator is using another thing. Is there like a standard around this?
So NIST, right, we all know it's a pretty good standard to look at. They say don't reuse private keys unless it's like super secure and in hardware security module, like details at the bottom, but like generally don't reuse them. But then, like every normal person, we're going to go on Google and say, what should we do? And we go to the first result, which is Stack Overflow post, and somebody says, my team told me to not reuse private keys. I feel like that's not really necessary. And the number one response is, yeah, that's not really good advice. You could reuse your private key.
Well, I know when I Google problems, I'm not going to read through a big NIST thing. I'm going to click Stack Overflow. And this is mixed messaging. NIST says do one thing. The NIST messaging seems like it's aligned with password reuse, right? They're like, don't reuse passwords, don't reuse private keys. But now we get to Stack Overflow, and now we're getting mixed messages on our Acme tools and mixed messages between Stack Overflow and NIST. This seems complicated. It seems like a messy, the people don't know what to do.
It is, and let's look at some examples of, real-world examples of people not knowing what to do, I guess. Let's look at Verizon here. This is the first case. I'm going to move this screen over. Oh, of course, love this during the live demo. It's down here. Fortunately, I had this page loaded already. It's kind of hard to see. All right, so just to orient everyone, I'll come over here. So there's 5 columns here, and this is cert.sh. This is one of those services, search engines basically, that looks at the logs that we were talking about before. So there's 5 columns. Cert.sh ID, we can like toss that. We don't need that. Logged at, also kind of irrelevant. Not before and not after. That's like when it starts to be valid and when it's expired. And then this is who issued it. So if we scroll down, sorry, I guess I'll do this here. At the very bottom, actually I forgot a critical part of this. At the top, it says what our search term was. That is searching by the public key associated with that certificate.
I'm going to be your podium here.
Oh, thank you. And so what that means is that all of the certificates we're looking at use the same private key. And this is Verizon. It's a very large company. And I'm not picking on Verizon because there's many examples of other large companies doing this, but I thought this was a particularly striking one. The first certificate was issued in 2012. The most recent certificate was issued in 2022.
That is wild.
10 years
10
they
years
used
of using
the same private key.
That's crazy.
And you might be thinking like, oh, is it the same site? Well, let's take a look here. Let's look at one. This is for collaborate, external, something messaging, ebiz.verizon.com. Then we go up and we go to this one. And this is some portal verizonbusiness.com. And then we go up a bit more. And then we'll find another one. And it's another Kofit? I don't know what that is. Something ebiz.verizon.com.
So Verizon is using the same key over and over again for a bunch of different websites. I mean, this is crazy.
Infodesk.verizon. And the cool thing, or interesting, is like DigiCert. We've got Verizon, their own CA. We've got CyberTrust. It's not just one CA that they're using this for. It's across a whole bunch of other different CAs. So like this is like pervasive in this case. And again, there's no, not again, just to know, and to be clear, there's no indication that the key is leaked, right? This isn't a security issue, aside from the fact that they're using basically the same password to generate these certificates.
That's wild.
But let's look at another example where they are reusing the same key that has actually been compromised. So let me.
So this would be an example where somebody puts the key compromise as like a reason for revoking or something?
Exactly.
I'm sorry, is the search term the private key or the public key?
The search term would be the public key.
Okay.
Yeah, because you can't. They don't have the private key. They only have access to the public key data, and that's like baked into, like, if you look through all the parts of a cert, you'll see like there's a public key. Good.
Quick question.
Sure.
In regard to cert.sh, essentially, if you have one of the public keys, it can essentially help recon for the other subdomains underneath that as well, and provide you with the other public keys for those other subdomains of the larger company, like the umbrella company?
You can make any search for any subdomain, and it will return for all of the certificates associated across, since like 2013 when they started logging, more or less. It will tell you all the public keys associated with
We're
those.
papering over some details here, but we
Yes.
will have time for questions here at the end. So,
All right, so this next example is going to be in Excel, because I'll explain this in a second. So this will be an example of a situation where an organization had a key compromise, right? Their private key is posted on GitHub somewhere. And they then had to revoke certificates, but yet they still issued new certificates using that compromised key. And so the reason it's in Excel and not on cert.sh is because I don't want to give away the organization, because we're actively working with them to remediate it, and there's a lot of ongoing back and forth. But and this is not the only organization. There's many, many, many organizations. But this was a cool one, actually.
so this is like the cat chat example, like the exact cat chat example, where they went to revoke the key, and then in the future they generated a new cert, and it's the same key as the revoked one.
Exactly. So they started generating certificates, and I know it's a little small. Let me see if I can blow it up a little bit. It wasn't easy to like incorporate this into slides, so maybe not. Okay, sorry. Oh, bottom right, thank you. Oh boy.
It's impressive reverse
Oh, it's tough.
mouse
Okay.
trackpadding
Yeah.
you're doing there.
All right, so the first time it was issued was in 2013. And then the most recent time was actually last week, and I'll show you that at the top, right? So as recent as last week, despite having been informed a little bit before then. But there's a lot of companies on this list. There is Amnesty International, I have this logo here. There is, well, it's too zoomed in now, but there's NASA websites. There's all types of financial institutions, credit unions, local in Hong Kong, the UK.
So this company is using that same key over and over again for all their customers, and at some point it got compromised, and they're still, even to as of last week, generating new certs with the same key?
Exactly. And so we can see in the logs that a key generated in 2023 was revoked due to key compromise. And the date it was revoked, it's a little bit on a column we can't see right now, was March 12th, 2024 of this year, right? And we can scroll up and we'll see that they revoked it, superseded, we can toss it out, revoked. But look, there's a couple domains that they didn't actually revoke it. And it's because this is for their client deployments. They were using the same private key across all different customer deployments. I think it was on-prem deployments. And it wasn't easy for them to revoke. And some certs just weren't revoked at all, right? Like there's several cases of them not being revoked. And not only that, like I mentioned at the beginning, this key is still being used and has been used after they knew it was compromised to generate new certificates. My best guess is it was in some documentation that somebody not on the security team was just giving to customers to run, and they were just handing them a private key to generate a certificate for. Maybe that's not the case. That's just my best guess. But it's kind of wild that we have this situation where a password, more or less, was leaked publicly, or to the point where they were calling it key compromise, yet they're still reusing the same private key.
They used that private key over 100 times for all these different customers, and then they made a mess for themselves when they had to go in and revoke it. They had to figure out where it was, and clearly they weren't able to get all of the places where that key was being used.
And if you are purchasing some services from an organization that is providing you a certificate, it's worth it to look in to see if they're reusing the same private key across a bunch of different customer deployments, because if some customer gets popped or that key gets stolen somehow, your own assets could be at risk possibly, right? Depending on how things are set up. So it's just an interesting attack vector. It's really easy to look for too. Like this data is freely and easily available. All you need is just a public key, and then you can return all other instances of that same public-private key set being used for other certificates. And to that end,
Yeah, how easy is it? Tell us more about that.
let me get out of this business real quick. Okay, so it is very easy. We launched a tool here. So we have a hosted version, and then also we have a freely available GitHub, like open source thing.
It's all open source. We're just running a copy of it somewhere in case you don't want to run it yourself.
Yes, exactly. So this is a key checker, and we're going to do an example here. The idea is, at this point, I'm just grabbing our domain just so we have an example, and we grab the certificate. So you could get this from obviously any domain that has TLS. And you download the CRT file, cert file, you copy that in, you paste that in, it's going to extract the public key and then run a search on cert.sh. And it's like a super cool service, but it is a little, there's some latency, it's a little buggy sometimes. Still very cool, very open source.
7 billion certs they're searching across. It's
a
impressive
lot.
they can do it at all.
It is. So it takes a little while sometimes, but in this case, you can see the only result was for our domain.
So that is an example of a key that hasn't been reused anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
And then also showing an example of you can actually search by the SHA-1 hash of the public key, and then it will return all certificates associated with that. So that's the core of the search, right? You are searching for a hash of the public key to then see every single private key that is, or every single certificate that is using that key. There's another quick example here. This is from the, if you were to run this locally using the tool we posted on GitHub, you can run command line. You can actually just paste in your domain. So if you want to check your company's domain, it will use OpenSSL to grab the cert, right, that, like the current cert, and check. And then it will spit out all of the certificates that have been logged, which should be most, that are using it.
Well, that was kind of subtle, but you searched Google before and 2 results came back?
Yeah, so there are things called pre-certificates and leaf certificates, which are an added layer of complexity to certificate transparency. But yes, in that case, there were 2, but it's fine.
I see. OK.
Yes.
Cool. Well, this sounds helpful. Now we can see whether or not our keys are being reused between multiple certs.
So that I think is interesting, and I hope that that's helpful for like whether internally you're on security or pen testing or whatever. I think there are different findings that you could bring to clients or your own company. But after all of this research, I was thinking, can we be reusing keys elsewhere? Like,
That's a good point. Like an encryption key isn't just useful for TLS. We use encryption keys for all kinds of things. Like we use encryption keys for SSH, for example. We take a private key, generate the public key, do the whole exchange with an SSH server. It's not signed by a certificate authority. It's a different, it's trust on first use kind of thing. But yeah, I wonder if people are reusing keys.
Well, the easiest thing that I can think of is I use SSH keys for GitHub. I'm sure a lot of people do.
Right.
It's a good question.
Yeah. So every time you use GitHub, you upload your public key, and then you tell GitHub, I'm allowed to talk SSH protocol to github.com. I can read and write to all the repos with the key public-private key pair that's uploaded. So I guess that's a good place to start. So that's where, long story short, we dug in. We asked the question, how many times is one GitHub profile using the same public SSH key as another GitHub profile? So this is 2 GitHub users that are using the same SSH key behind the scenes. This number was pretty startling, 130,000 times. 130,000 GitHub users are using the same SSH key as another GitHub user. I would not have guessed the number was going to be that large, but that's 2% of every single GitHub user is sharing the same private key as a different GitHub user. Now, we've done a ton of research as an industry into password reuse, but honestly, I don't think we've uncovered enough about this private key reuse, because this looks like a big problem.
It is. How did we get that 2%? How did you get that 2%?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So it turns out, if you go to any GitHub user's profile and you type .keys at the end of it, it gives you a list of all the public keys that they've uploaded to their profile, which is a little weird. I don't know why GitHub makes that information available, but they do. And then all we need to do is get the list of all the GitHub users. And there's a lot of ways to get that data. You can hit GitHub's event stream, and it just gives you a stream of all the GitHub events with all usernames. You could go to githubarchive.org, and it'll give you a nice zip file of all the previous events, and you get all the usernames that way. There's a lot of different ways to get this data. But then once you get all those usernames, all you have to do is hit .keys for all of them, and you can download all the public keys that everybody ever uploaded to their profiles, and then we're just string matching. Have any of those public keys been reused between profiles? And it turns out 2% of the time, yeah, they are being reused between profiles.
Now, that's crazy, but I'm going to go on a limb here and ask a question that sounds crazy.
Okay, I'm listening.
Is anybody using the same private key for their GitHub account as a TLS cert for some domain?
Why would anyone do that?
I don't know.
That seems silly.
That's a dumb question.
You're coming up with a silly question
I'm sorry.
there. Well, I mean, here's the thing. I can't think of a reason how this could happen, because these are completely different tool chains. We use an SSH command to generate SSH keys. We use a Acme protocol to generate our certificates. I don't know how this could happen, but we looked into it, and a few hundred times, yeah, people are reusing between SSH and TLS the same private key. Like, you have to go out of your way to do that. And it's a small number compared to the other numbers we're talking about, but you have a large enough data set, people are going to do some wild things, and yeah, key reuse, this is a real issue.
And so if I were to find a private key sitting on some computer, say it's a pen test, how do I check if that's associated with a GitHub user?
Yeah. Or is it associated with multiple users?
Or multiple
right?
users, yeah.
Or is it being used for TLS? Like all those questions, right? Well, it turns out, for GitHub in particular, if you take that private key and you SSH into github.com, instead of getting a terminal, GitHub will respond with a big message that says, welcome username. Mm-hmm. That's pretty helpful, because then you get the username that it goes with. So now if you know one of the usernames it goes with, and you revoke it for that user, it begs the question, is it maybe being reused for any other users? We can SSH into GitHub, and GitHub will keep saying, welcome user, and we revoke until we hit the end. But that's a little bit of a pain, and so we also open sourced a feature of TruffleHog, which is an open source secrets tool, that could take any key that it finds and check that public key against not just GitHub to tell you if it matches any users, but also against TLS. So if you have that weird issue before, we said it happens a few hundred times where it's between TLS and GitHub, this tool can help that. It could tell you whether or not it's being used to encrypt certificates anywhere, and it could also tell you whether or not it can SSH into however many GitHub profiles that you have to deal with. So this is like a big problem that we didn't realize was as big as it was until we started looking into it, and so we've been open sourcing a bunch of tools to try to help with it, but I suspect industry has a long way to go before we get a wrangle on this.
And I'm sure there's other places we haven't looked at for key reuse that maybe might be an interesting source of research
Here's
too.
a question.
Oh, yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, we jumped ahead. Yeah, but I mean, what are some other uses for private keys you can think of? I can think of a couple off my what about Bitcoin? You think any Bitcoin, maybe the wallet is being reused for SSH or something weird like that? Or what about GPG keys? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of different ways people use private keys, and we're just cracking the surface here for how they're being reused. But it's every place we've looked so far has been pretty bad. Well, that's what we got, but we have maybe a little bit of time for questions here. Yes, question.
I have one in case I was not following closely enough. That was the private key they're showing you on GitHub?
In this screen, you mean?
On the one before that.
So no, this is the public key. Yeah. Oh, they're definitely not giving you the private key.
Well, they don't get the private key. GitHub doesn't know the private key.
Exactly.
The only thing you upload to GitHub is the public key.
You can just do string matching with the public key to.
Yep.
If you find two that are the same, the private key is obviously the same.
Yep. Exactly. Question.
So you look for your subdomain, and you look for the subdomain of your company, and you see that there's a bunch of different subdomains that all share the same public key. How do you know if is there a way for you to validate whether or not the private key, if that combination, I'm looking to see if my private key's been leaked and we don't know, right?
Oh, if the key has leaked out already?
If the private key is leaked out already and we don't know.
Well, so I think we're making the case that as good hygiene, for all your certificates, you should be using different keys.
Yeah.
And if one of them happens to leak out, at least it only impacts the one website. It's not impacting all the rest of them. So this tool is just helpful in separating out, making sure that each of your domains have their own keys. Yeah. Whether or not your key leaked out, that's a slightly different question, but open source TruffleHog, a tool that we maintain, is helpful for that separately. Like you can use TruffleHog to scan a bunch of GitHub stuff. There's a lot of tools that are helpful for answering that question of whether or not your key leaked out. These tools that we're talking about that we just open sourced are more focused on just making sure you're using different keys for different domains.
But certificate transparency has all those logs. So if you do run a search for your subdomain, you could see any certificate that has been logged that's related to your subdomain. So maybe that would show a misissued certificate. I don't know.
Can I come by your booth later and ask about?
Sure, absolutely, yeah. It's just like crt.sh is like that search engine. Like that's like, you just type the subdomain and you can look through all those search results, but happy to discuss later, yeah, definitely.
Is there a question over here?
Oh yeah, you mentioned that some subdomains won't show up in cert.sh. What are the circumstances why they don't show up?
Yeah, I mean,
So there's a wildcard that you can specify on a certificate that is just this certificate applies to star.website.com. And so if you're searching a particular subdomain, the wildcard applies to that subdomain, but you'd have to search the parent domain to see that because the subdomain isn't listed. The wildcard is the thing that's listed. So that's one example.
the other situation is, so the forcing mechanism for certificate authorities to use certificate transparency is the user agents, so the browsers basically. So I believe it's Chrome and Safari were the first to basically say, if there's no indication in the certificate that I'm looking at that it has been logged, it's not safe. And so that was a forcing mechanism for organizations, CAs, to submit. It's possible for a certificate authority to not submit. I don't know what the repercussions are, and I feel like in the US specifically, it's such dominance of Chrome and Safari and these browsers that it's probably be hard to navigate somewhere that's not logging. But there's probably other places that don't actually log. But you have
I'll be honest, it hurt me a little bit. You didn't mention Firefox.
Oh,
Its
Firefox.
market share has shrank so
Sorry.
much. But
yeah. But yeah, so I guess like there's most certificate authorities you come across are logging, but there are cases where they might not log, and if they don't log, then cert.sh wouldn't have that. That's like the more, and I'm not an expert in it, but like that's kind of what I glean would happen. Yeah, of course. Question in the back?
So when you generate a public-private key, you use like something like SSH key jail.
Sure.
So sometimes it specifies password. So that password, is it of any use or?
So that's a funny story. When you create, this is levels of encryption. When you create a cryptographic key, you can encrypt that encryption key with a symmetric key or password or passphrase. So that is, if anybody finds that thing, they have to know what that password or passphrase is to unlock it to be able to do the asymmetric cryptography with it. This is a whole other talk, by the way, but a little bit into this rabbit hole. You can guess those passwords because you have all the information you need to do lots of guesses offline. And so at some point we thought it'd be fun to build into open source Trufflehog. What if every time we find a encrypted private key, we guess the top 200 passwords against it? And so when you run Trufflehog against a key, if it is encrypted with a password, it will by default try 200 passwords against it to see whether or not it can guess that password. But that's a relatively naive approach. A much more sophisticated approach would be to load it into a GPU to guess 1 billion passwords against this thing. And more often than not, if that password wasn't machine generated, if a human generated a password for it, someone will be able to guess what that was. So does it provide any protection? Yes, if you're using securely random generated stuff, but it's like a level of defense. I wouldn't 100% rely on it. And if you're using a human generated password, no. I mean, people are probably going to be able to guess it.
Question?
Did you perform any kinds of root cause analysis of why all those private keys share? For instance, it can be some random number generator that is performing badly. We know that happened in the past.
Mm-hmm. We looked into it a little bit, and we think we know what the main causes are for the SSH issue and for the TLS issue. I don't think random number generators colliding is the issue. I think the issue on the TLS side is what Joe was showing before, is some of the automation frameworks where every time it makes a new cert are using the same key, and it's right in the docs. It's right in the comments. It's not even like a hidden vulnerability or anything. They're advertising it.
My question is because having 7 billion keys means 7 billion numbers that are prime numbers. Are we for some reason, is there any kind of space, maybe it's 1024 bits, that we already spend all the private keys there and stuff like that?
So if you do the birthday paradox on a 2048 private key or a 4096 private key, no. It's never going to collide if you're using secure random. But then there's another question of like, okay, well, what if it's like Raspberry Pis that are generating this? And what if those Raspberry Pis on boot all have the same chips and they don't have enough entropy? It's possible, but the vast, vast majority of reuse here is due to frameworks, or in the case of SSH, it's a little different. We think what was mostly going on there is just people that for every company they worked at, they made a different GitHub account, and they just kept using that same key through all their accounts. So it's not an issue with the generation, it's more on the human side. It's more just that human just didn't generate new keys, and now all of a sudden their key gets compromised in this new company, and you can go back in time to all those old profiles and log into all those old profiles with that same private key.
So no evidence about a technical issue, but a people issue.
Everything that we found points to the vast majority of, it's 10% of 7 billion is 700 million. The vast majority of those 700 million are human issues or framework issues. Like they're issues that aren't like a vulnerability. It's more like a guy in a GitHub issue said, I think we should use the same key for everything.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Yes.
So what would you say, whilst it's subjective, obviously, on a personal basis, on an internal or external basis, what do you feel is the best way to potentially generate like a POC for this? Utilizing TruffleHog, you would say, or just in general being able to see on cert.sh that the key is reused, that's enough, you would say, from a different perspective, I'd say,
Yeah.
to be able to show impact on first? Or would you say utilizing TruffleHog would be the best way to generate that POC and show it that?
I think just if you're looking to prove internally that somebody shouldn't be reusing private keys, I think there's a bit of education that needs to be made, and then evidence of them, maybe like a cert.sh, like, we can't see it here, but like the search results showing that it's been reused, like Verizon's been reusing it for 10 years, like that's pretty compelling, because like at the end of the day, that's basically a password being reused for 10 years. Like, is it exposed? Maybe, maybe not. But either way, we know as an industry that we shouldn't be reusing passwords for 10 years. Why are we doing it for private keys? And I think that's a pretty easy selling point or thing to sell to internally. And then also the solution's pretty easy. Just if you're using the Acme protocol, just like don't reuse the same key. There's like even though acme.sh, the second most popular tool to do this, they have a flag that you can run that avoids this whole issue. It's just like you have to know to run it. Yes, question in the back.
So a little dumb question and probably related to this. So the reason we rotate passwords, symmetric keys and asymmetric keys, are they different or are they same? Meaning passwords, reusing passwords is wrong, we know, because passwords are sent over channel and reusing can probably be, versus private keys, inherently they are different. So do you think they're needed for different?
Let's maybe think about passwords a little bit. So for a long time, password managers didn't exist. And everybody, myself, Joe, I'm sorry to reveal the dirty laundry, but everybody was reusing their same password for all the different services. And what happened was RockU had their whole database posted on the public internet. Dropbox had their whole database posted on the public internet. LinkedIn had their whole database posted on the public internet. Adobe had their whole database posted on the public internet. And so at least one instance of everybody's password got out there. And because everybody was reusing it between services, if you got somebody's password from that breach, that allowed you to log into all the different places that password is being used. Okay, so now let's talk about private keys. So what happens if you're using the same private key for all these different customers, for all these different websites? If one time that password gets compromised, and maybe it's not compromised because Dropbox's database got public, maybe it's compromised because a developer put it on GitHub. Whatever that compromise reason is, you can then take that private key and you can reuse it for all these different websites. So it's like very, very, very similar. There's some subtle differences where like, okay, it's not going to be in Dropbox's database. It's maybe going to be our Joe, the white hat guy, put it on GitHub. So maybe the compromise reason is different, but the impact is the same. You can attack all these different websites because of the reuse.
So the impact is same, but the likelihood is different in both scenarios.
I mean, it's hard to measure what the likelihood of probably we could do a case study to figure out what the likelihood of somebody posting a key on GitHub, which is high,
yes,
and the likelihood of a company having their database stolen, which is also high. I don't know how they rank up in highness. We probably could do a case study around it, but they're both things we need to be worried about. They happen often enough. We need to worry about them.
Any other questions this side? No? Okay. Cool. I think we're at time. Thank you all very much for
So great.
listening.